What you are seeing on the screen are two men dedicated to playing the video game Madden NFL. This image is from a live broadcast of a championship that was being streamed live, but if you take a closer look at the boy on the right, you'll notice a red laser that was pointed directly at his heart. This was visible for only a few milliseconds, so there was almost no time for anyone to react to what was about to happen. It's important to note that the video you're about to see does not contain sensitive images, but the audio alone is likely to send chills down your spine.
It's a lot. It's going to be hard to get them on stream. It's
not
a lot.
It's not a tough out today. Excuse me, not an easy out.
David Katz, a 24-year-old who had just been eliminated from the tournament, decided to pull two guns out of his backpack to commit the most terrible tragedy in video game history. To understand who David Katz is and what led him to commit this massacre, we must look at his past. David Katz was born on December 22, 1993, in Baltimore, Maryland. His early life was significantly affected by the legal battle between his parents, Richard and Elizabeth Katz, who had divorced in 2005 when he was 12 years old. Since the divorce, his parents had been embroiled in a custody dispute over David and his older brother, Brandon, a battle that lasted a decade and profoundly affected David for life. When the custody trials began, a therapist described David in court as a child in the midst of a psychiatric crisis due to a depression that seemed to intensify after his parents' divorce, impacting the young man's motivation, altering his eating habits, and causing sleep issues. Since his early teens, David was medicated with antidepressants and risperidone, an antipsychotic for conditions like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. As his symptoms didn't appear to improve, he was diagnosed with dysthymia, a persistent depressive disorder that can last a lifetime. In the custody battle for the children, the fact that David's mother was a toxicologist for the FDA, the agency overseeing food and medicines in the US, was brought up. Richard, the boy's father, often complained that Elizabeth resorted to mental health professionals and psychiatric drugs instead of parental guidance. He implied that when David showed signs of demotivation or inattention, his mother would quickly turn to medication rather than helping him cope without the side effects of drugs. Additionally, David's father claimed a psychiatrist had advised against the prescribed medications, citing a study about increased violent thoughts in minors. When David was 13, he was twice admitted to a mental health facility in Rockville, Maryland, due to depression and missing school. Court records indicate that during episodes of depression or dissociation, he would cry inexplicably and curl up on the floor in a fetal position. David remained in his mother's care due to the recommendation of a court-appointed attorney representing the children's interests, who advised that Elizabeth be granted full custody. Nevertheless, David expressed deep unhappiness with his mother and communicated this to the judge in a letter at age 16, requesting to live with his father. He reported that his mother would get drunk, yell, or call the police for minor infractions, like coming home late. Neighbors confirmed frequent police visits to their home, yet his request to live with his father was denied, and David remained with his mother for 2 more years. By 2010, David had failed almost all his classes at Hammond High School. His mother testified that he would stay up playing video games until early morning, even on school days, and would sometimes go days without grooming. If his Xbox was taken away, he would pace in his room or around the house. David, like many young people, used video games as an escape. However, his obsession with competitive online gaming grew, along with his anger issues, which became apparent when he punched a hole in his room's wall after losing a game. Despite the challenges, the boy managed to graduate from Hammond High School in 2011, and by 2014, he had enrolled at the University of Maryland. Fast forward to 2018, David abruptly left university and moved back to Baltimore to live with his father, Richard. His father believed that David had a strong mind and didn't need medication to function. However, it became apparent that David was increasingly disconnected from reality, his expression often vacant. There was some merit to the concern about David taking many medications at a young age, but by now, ceasing antidepressants abruptly was likely to do more harm than good. David struggled to find employment and continued to find solace in video games, particularly particularly Madden NFL, which made him feel accomplished for the first time. Under the nickname Bread, David had racked up several local tournament victories by 2017. In February of that year, he won an EA Sports organized tournament representing the Buffalo Bills, earning $3,500 and a trip to Los Angeles for the next championship, where he also had the chance to meet NFL players. Despite his victory, David showed little joy or excitement. Observers couldn't tell if he was winning or losing just by his expression, and a reporter noted the difficulty in getting David to engage in conversation, forcing the reporter to fill in the gaps to avoid awkwardness by commenting on David's stoic demeanor, describing him as businesslike and not there to make friends. The year 2018 looked promising with the release of Madden NFL 19, and esports were surging in popularity with significant prizes at stake. The winner that year would get a paid trip to Las Vegas for the championship finals, with a chance to win up to $165,000. David traveled from his father's home to Jacksonville for the event, which was to be held in a commercial area of the city at the Chicago Pizza Building, which housed a bar called Good Luck Have Fun, a local gamers hub. The name suggested a positive and enjoyable experience, a stark contrast to what was about to unfold there. The Madden NFL game was known for having one of the most peaceful fan bases and player communities in esports. Despite its impressive sales, public interest in watching others play Madden has been somewhat limited, perhaps because people prefer watching real-life sports, which in turn affects sponsorship interest in such events. Consequently, the Madden community was relatively small, comprising mostly adult players who often had other jobs and some with families, making it challenging to dedicate themselves entirely to the game. The sense of community within this group was notably strong due to its size. Many were friends outside of the game, and their matches resembled friendly games rather than high-stakes competitions because of the positive atmosphere. On August 25, 2018, the day of the eagerly anticipated competition finally arrived. Interestingly, although event organizers offered to cover David's flight from Baltimore to Jacksonville, he chose to drive the over 100-kilometer distance with his car, possibly because of restrictions on what could be carried on a flight. Upon arriving in Jacksonville, David checked into an inexpensive hotel on Saturday morning and later headed to the gaming bar to start the tournament qualifiers. The venue was crowded with over 100 people and limited seating, but the atmosphere was charged with healthy and competitive spirit. Most attendees were part of the Madden community or were friends from prior gatherings, so there was mutual encouragement, except for David Katz. Initially, David won several matches, maintaining his usual quiet demeanor and even wearing sunglasses indoors, which wasn't considered odd due to his known eccentric behavior. David narrowly qualified for the next day of the tournament. On Sunday, August 26th, the remaining players returned to the bar for the concluding rounds of the tournament, which would determine the winner, set to compete in Las Vegas for a more significant prize and recognition. The matches were now in an elimination format, with winners advancing and losers being knocked out of the tournament. Around 1 p.m., with the tournament in full swing, it was David's turn to compete. He appeared exactly as he had the day before, without a change of shirt, still donning his sunglasses. His opponent was Reginald Brown. The match was intense from the start, with David initially falling behind but managing to tie the game before halftime. In the second half, he exploited a recent rule change that Reginald was unaware of, retaining possession of the ball and scoring multiple points. Some in the community viewed this strategy as unethical, though it was technically within the rules, so much so that even some commentators were not aware of the change. Despite his strategic gameplay, David's skills did not fully match up with the top-tier players, and he ultimately lost due to critical mistakes in the last minutes, resulting in his elimination in the first round of the final qualifiers. According to a witness at the event, it was less than 10 minutes after this loss that the first shots rang out. David's behavior after his match against Reginald was consistent with his previous antisocial tendencies. After a brief stare, he left without uttering a word. While this was typical for David, the circumstances that day may have been compounded by a lapse in psychiatric medication or the particular sting of defeat. It's possible that the accumulation of his life's troubles had become unbearable, leading to a breaking point. He exited the bar quietly and walked to his car as the tournament inside continued. At 1:30 p.m. on that serene Sunday, the competition went on. Elijah Clayton, a standout and popular figure in the competitive scene, was aiming to fund his university education through his gaming successes. The venue was packed. Over 100 attendees squeezed into the central area, scarcely able to move. It was in these cramped quarters that David chose to return, this time with a concealed and ominous addition to his attire. 2 firearms secreted away in his jacket, previously carried in his backpack, one equipped with a red laser sight that cast a bright dot wherever it was aimed. He had acquired these guns legally in Maryland a month prior, despite state restrictions against individuals with psychological conditions or those who have been institutionalized for mental health concerns, as was David's case. The law discourages firearm possession by such individuals, but it seems the seller did not conduct a thorough background check. When later questioned by the police, the seller stated that David had not disclosed any mental health issues. Naturally, someone planning a massacre would not likely be truthful when asked about their suitability to own a weapon. Returning to the unfolding events, David re-entered the bar around 1:34 p.m. with both guns in hand. He made his way to the back of the venue, near the commentator's booth and the area where most of the professional players were gathered, watching the matches. It was here that one of the most harrowing pieces of evidence was collected, a recording capturing the moment David began firing. The recording chillingly shows the laser sight targeting Clayton's chest. Then the first shots rang out, throwing the event into utter chaos. The initial shots fired by David struck Elijah Clayton, fatally wounding him. In the ensuing minutes, the room became engulfed in terror, panic, and screams. The live broadcast of the event was abruptly cut off, with the sounds of shattering glass and people falling to the ground being the only audible noises through the commentator's abandoned microphones. Witnesses later recounted that as David started shooting, his facial expression was as emotionless as always. However, amidst the horror, a chilling detail was noticed. David was murmuring under his breath. Those who saw him thought he might have been muttering insults or perhaps even prayers. But one survivor who was in close proximity shed light on the grim reality. David was counting the shots as he discharged them, one by one. As panic set in, people began to crowd the exits while the gunfire continued to resound within the room. The subsequent details of this tragic event have been pieced together from police reports and the accounts of 2 players who survived that day's shooting. Tony Montanino was among them, and he initially mistook the sounds of gunfire and terror for fireworks being set off inside the room. While sitting with his back to David, Tony felt a searing pain as a bullet struck his back, causing him to fall off his chair. In that instant, he and others around him scrambled for cover, not knowing where to escape. David had moved on, shooting towards the opposite end of the room. Tony was gripped by the fear that if David came back to target the wounded, he would be helpless, trapped without an escape route. Mustering his courage, Tony made a dash for one of the bar's emergency exits. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the floor was smeared with blood, marked by the tracks of shoes. Despite the chaos, Tony considered himself fortunate. Others were still struggling to exit as the emergency doors were blocked. It was then, amid the frantic escape, that he saw people sidestepping something on the ground while looking on in horror. That's when the dreadful realization hit him. The object they were avoiding was the body of his good friend and one of the most cherished professional players in the community, Taylor Robertson. 27-year-old Taylor was a father to a young daughter and had recently started his family. Like many others, he turned his passion for gaming into a means to earn extra income to support his family, all the while making new friends and strengthening his ties within the gaming community. Tragically, after the events of August 26th, Taylor would never return home to his family. Another survivor of the tragedy was George Amadeo. He was standing close to David when the shooting began. One bullet struck him in the chest, another tore through his wrist and hand, and as he attempted to flee the bar, he was hit by a third bullet at hip level. Despite his severe injuries, he managed to crawl to an emergency exit and reached a restaurant on the nearby Jacksonville Landing. By this time, the police had been notified, and the city's sheriff had issued a warning advising locals to stay clear of the Chicago Pizza Building and surrounding areas due to the active shooter situation. There was confusion among the authorities about whether they were dealing with one or multiple shooters potentially involved in a mass shooting. The first responders to the gunfire and ensuing pandemonium were firefighters who, by chance, were conducting training on the street opposite the event. Without any protective of gear or weapons, several of them bravely entered the venue in search of survivors or to render aid amidst the crisis. The authorities rapidly stormed the seemingly empty building, but there was no trace of David in the main room, as he had, unbeknownst to them, retreated to a hallway away from the chaos. It was here that David's earlier murmurs, heard as he was shooting, became a focal point of the investigation. The conclusion drawn by investigators was that he had been counting his ammunition to ensure he had a final bullet reserved, as he knew precisely where he intended to use it. Before any officer could encounter him alive, David made certain the last bullet was in the magazine, disengaged the safety on his weapon, and used it on himself. The terror in Jacksonville ceased with that final act. 11 individuals were treated at the hospital, all without serious long-term injuries. However, the violence claimed 3 lives: Taylor Robertson, Elijah Clayton, and David Katz, the assailant. In the wake of the tragedy, one of the wounded who had been shot twice filed lawsuits against the esports organizer and the Chicago pizza venue. The legal actions pointed to negligence in the layout of the building, specifically citing the emergency exits that were not fully accessible, including one that was completely blocked. The lawsuits emphasized the absence of police or private security, which is typically employed for events drawing large crowds. In a press statement, another professional competitor, known as Jay, expressed his belief that divine intervention had spared him on that fateful day. He recounted that he had gone back to his hotel to nap just before the tragedy unfolded, a decision made after a loss in the competition that, if it had been a win, would have placed him in the perilous situation alongside the other players and David Katz. Moreover, David, who was not known for being talkative, had inquired to an electronic arts representative about Jay's whereabouts and when he might return. This detail added a layer of premeditation to the day's events. In the days following the incident, the Chicago pizza restaurant was permanently closed by the Florida governor's mandate. The Jacksonville Police Department announced that the FBI was involved in the investigation, probing whether the attack was premeditated or a manifestation of David's deteriorating mental health. Both of David's parents, Elizabeth and Richard Katz, were cooperating with the investigation, which was exhaustive in its scope. From the tragic narrative, it's inferred that David may have felt out of place his entire life. His downward spiral accelerated after his psychiatric disorders worsened and he stopped taking his medication, decisions supported by his father. David had immersed himself in video games, hoping to find some relief and purpose, but the weight of his depression was overwhelming. Perhaps the realization that he couldn't match the skill level of other players in the one area he had dedicated his life to contributed to his sense of failure. However, the methodical nature of the events suggested it was not a spontaneous psychotic episode. It appears that the decision to carry out the attack was premeditated, and there is speculation that if David had won the tournament, he might have executed his plan at a different location.